What happens when federal law enforcement stops following the rules that it's meant to uphold? In this edition of our Waxing Confidential series, Steve Wax breaks down ICE's expanding power, from mass raids to secret detentions, and the constitutional dangers that they pose. We explore the erosion of due process, the limits of federal authority, and what it means when the rule of law starts to slip away. It's all coming up next. This is Trailblazing Justice, episode 72, recorded Thursday, July 10th, 2025. Waxing Confidential, Unmarked, Unchecked, Unconstitutional. It's time for Trailblazing Justice, the weekly podcast where we discuss civil and criminal rights in Oregon and beyond. Trailblazing Justice is a production of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. Here's Bobbin.
Welcome back to another episode of Trailblazing Justice. I'm Bobbin Singh, the Executive Director of the Oregon Justice Resource Center, and we're back with Steve Wax with another edition of Waxing Confidential. It was 2 weeks ago we talked about the birthright citizenship case, and this week we're going to talk a little bit about federal law enforcement and the things that are going on with ICE. But because last time we talked about the birthright citizenship case, there's actually been some new developments as we're recording this that came out earlier this morning. So, in another immigration case out of Florida. So, some interesting developments. You want to start off giving us an update on that and some of your thoughts?
Sure, Bobbin. So, in the birthright case, the Supreme Court, allowed the Trump executive order to go into effect, which raised questions about variations in the law of citizenship from state to state, since a number of the cases that were before the Supreme Court had been brought by states' attorneys general, all of whom are Democrats, and the right of the AGs to bring those actions, at least temporarily, is in place, so that a person even today could potentially, be a lawful citizen in New York or Oregon, for example, but not in the states that were not party to the lawsuit. The court said that while they were frowning on nationwide injunctions and said that they would be the final arbiter deciding if any such thing could take place, they did say that there is a vehicle in the law through which individual district judges could issue injunctions that would apply nationwide, and that is what's called a class action. There's a rule in the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure that authorizes courts, when there is a numerous group of people who have the same issue, to certify what's called a class and decide a lawsuit with some named plaintiffs, but for all people who are similarly situated if they fall within the class. Well, immediately after the Supreme Court's decision, a class action suit was filed. And a couple of days later, several more class action suits were filed. A district court in New Hampshire has gotten first to the question of whether the class of people who say that they have similar interests and should be certified to bring an action on behalf of all persons similarly situated. That's been certified now as a legitimate class. And the district court entered an injunction, preliminarily to the pursuit of the lawsuit, that prohibits enforcement of the executive order on birthright citizenship to the child members of the class, whether they are in New Hampshire, where the case was brought, whether they were named in that lawsuit, or whether they're certified to be part of the class everywhere in the country. So, that case will, in all likelihood, get back to the Supreme Court pretty quickly, assuming that the Trump administration challenges it, and assuming that it challenges it in the same way, that is, on the procedural ground. Does the district court have the authority to issue this injunction? So I thought that was an interesting follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that happened is an action out of the Supreme Court this week on a different issue related to immigration and interstate travel. So the other issue that has come up this week involves a different aspect of this question of different citizenship rights in different states. Florida and four or five or five or six other states have passed laws that make it a crime to enter the state if you are unlawful. And the people brought a lawsuit to challenge that, and the Supreme Court this week, in a procedural decision similar to all of these quick emergency administrative type decisions, did not allow those laws to go into effect pending the lawsuits that will resolve whether or not they are constitutional. So I thought that was interesting that the court in the immigration area was saying, no, you can't have this limitation on people's rights go into effect when the limitation was being imposed by a state as opposed to the federal government. So they have been very solicitous of the president when it comes to his power over immigration. And here they're saying when the state is intruding on the president's power of immigration, no states, you can't do that. So that was just another interesting follow-up. This whole area of the extent of the president's power, the Supreme Court's willingness to find that it exceeds the Constitution, is in a state of flux, and the confusion about immigration status just continues to reign and change, seemingly sometimes from day to day.
Yeah, what's interesting, it seems like both of these cases, I think the ACLU had involvement in, maybe I think represented the plaintiffs representing the plaintiffs in the class action, and I'm trying to understand their role in the Florida one, but it looks like they were directly involved. But just goes again to the creative lawyering that's happening around this country in response to Trump. I mean, very quickly, I know after the Supreme Court decision came out on the birthright citizenship, there are a couple of groups that immediately filed class actions, and it was just sort of a race to see which district court would respond in the way the court in New Hampshire did, which is interesting. I mean, it says it would certify a class for all children. They left out the parents, but at least what I quickly read is that there's not a material difference in at least how the injunction would play out. But yeah, it does say that it's on a fast track for the Supreme Court. And, the Supreme Court articulated this is the vehicle, or, the way in which you bring these. So that's what they've done. And now it'll be interesting to see if the Supreme Court actually listens to its own, what it has said. I mean, it reminds me of, like, in our own work that we do here on the state, we'll represent someone in a case, and oftentimes what you have is the state or the Department of Justice arguing, no, you shouldn't have brought it up in this case, in this civil vehicle. This should have been brought up in the criminal case. So then you go back and you try to do it in the criminal case, and then they argue out the other side of their mouth saying, no, you should have brought it up in on the civil side. This criminal case is not the right vehicle. And unless the highest court in the land actually makes a statement to say which is the right way to do it, that argument is technically available, and they use it all the time. So here the Supreme Court has actually said, this is the vehicle. So, kudos to the lawyers for getting out there really quickly and lawyering this. And even with the immigration one, where it sounds like, it's using the arguments of the plenary power of the federal government over immigration to not allow the states to interfere with that. So I don't know, just interesting,
Interesting and scary. Yeah. And makes it that much more difficult for the people who are affected by all this directly to know what to do, which way to go. And for all of us who are affected, not necessarily directly because we're not subject to removal from the country, but we're affected by what's going on with our fellow, residents of this country.
Mhm.
It's just, there's so many adjectives that I can put after that word just. Let's just leave it as it's just something.
Yeah, I continue to be inspired and grateful for the army of attorneys that are out there that are fighting, and engaging in this creative litigation, and getting the federal courts to respond in these ways. So, but I want to segue into a different topic, one we've sort of teased out a couple of times, but as the federal defender, when you're here in Oregon, you obviously had to deal with federal law enforcement, at least their behaviors, their actions, their treatment of the clients that you represented. And, there were certain, seemingly, I'd imagine, some guidelines and etiquettes and practices um, that were sort of just expected. And now we're seeing like a rapid, or at least from my perspective, a different approach by federal law enforcement, specifically ICE. And I just wanted to pick your brain a little bit about your thoughts of what you're seeing, how ICE is operating now in the United States with, going in plain clothes, having gaiters and sunglasses on, unmarked vehicles, not even presenting their badges or even having the right identification on their clothing. And essentially you have individuals in militaristic kind of equipment jumping out of cars, kidnapping people, and no one knows who they are, what they're doing. And I don't know I'm just curious about what your impressions are based on your experience as the federal defender, and your sort of involvement or dealings with federal law enforcement in the past. And if you've noticed any kind of shift and what this shift may signal at this point.
It's a very tough subject, Bobbin. So what I can offer is, as federal defender in Oregon for 31 years, I had plenty of experience with the whole alphabet soup of federal law enforcement agencies, including what was known, then as the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS. The overwhelming majority of cases that we would see coming into the federal defender office would be, brought, if they were originated by federal law enforcement, because some were originated through state law enforcement and then referred to the feds for prosecution, by people who carried out their responsibilities in what I would call a professional and open way. And I think that we in this country have been fortunate that the law enforcement people, not always, but almost always, overwhelmingly, comply with the law, understand that their obligation, is to act within the law, and that the people they are arresting are people deserving of, some sort of respect. To be sure, there were times when clients were, beaten up. There were times when clients were very roughly handled, but that was the exception, by far. Most of the time, when federal law enforcement people are, intruding on a person's, freedom to, be someplace, to go someplace, if the federal law enforcement, wants to intercede, they identify themselves. A whole body of law, developed around the ability to, stop and inquire, at what do the police need to stop a person on the street and ask that person a question? Just sort of basic thing. Whether the question is, who are you? Are you in this country legally? What are you doing here? What's in your backpack? Police can ask you that question, always have been able to. In order to stop you, to get an answer, a law, developed of was called stop and frisk, that the police had to have reasonable suspicion, a much lower standard than the standard to arrest or search, which is probable cause. And if a police officer wants to ask you a question, the police officer would, as a matter of course, identify him or herself. FBI, hi, I'm Agent so-and-so from the FBI, or, from the INS, whatever it happened to be. And the INS had, and ICE has, however, different legal authority than other law enforcement people. And for an arrest to be made by an FBI agent, an ATF agent, a DEA agent, the officer has to have probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed. And there are circumstances in which they have to have a warrant signed by a judge, or they're observing something that causes them to believe they have probable cause to make an arrest, actually stop you and hold you, detain you for anything more than a brief time, which is okay on reasonable suspicion. Well, in the ICE statutes, primary one, 8 USC 1357, which sets out their powers, the ICE people are given the authority to stop a person if they have reasonable suspicion that they're here illegally. Reasonable suspicion, not probable cause. It's the lower standard as a general proposition. They also can get administrative warrants. That is, they can get warrants from INS administrative officers who are not federal judges or federal magistrates, the lower federal judges appointed by the presidentially appointed judges. The authority of the ICE to act on immigration matters is clearest at the border, where the rights of the individual are the least. All of us coming through the border are routinely searched. They go through our suitcases, take our phones. That's at the border. Well, decades ago, the Supreme Court authorized similar authority at roving border searches. And then they authorized it at fixed checkpoints. But this is all, in proximity to the border. Well, the ICE people are not acting near the border when they're acting in Oregon, I guess, unless they're right on the ocean. But that's not an international border. And they are not showing themselves. They're not wearing jackets that say ICE on it. Often. Sometimes they are. One sees on TV, on the back of a jacket, some of the cops, DEA, FBI. Well, the reality is that is often how people do identify themselves as law enforcement officers of a federal agency. In addition to presenting identification when approaching a person and taking action, that doesn't require getting a person down on the ground and handcuffs on, for safety reasons before making the identification. Well, in addition to statutes that give the ICE people broader authority to stop a person, reasonable suspicion you're here illegally, the Code of Federal Regulations specifically allow the ICE to act without identifying themselves. Specifically, don't have to identify yourself before you approach someone, before you stop someone. Only have to do it under the Code of Federal Regulations as soon as it's practical and safe. That's the language in the code. And how that gets interpreted in the field seems to have expanded tremendously. It's different in that respect. The ICE authority is different. And the attitude toward that authority and how to wield the authority that agency has seems to be different than it used to be. Now, you have to remember, 30 years ago, the Federal Defender Office, would get cases from time to time where there were workplace raids, where the INS, would learn that a particular farmer, for example, or factory owner was employing many illegal, people who were in the country unlawfully, and they would conduct raids, there. Those raids would result in people who were in the country lawfully being, stopped, held for a while, and sometimes arrested until they could establish that they had legal status here. So workplace raids are not new. What is new seems to be the frequency and intensity of those actions. Less respect for the presumption of innocence that is in our law, less respect for the language in their basic statute, 8 U.S.C. 1357, that race or ethnicity alone is not enough to believe that a person is in the country illegally. So if you go into a workplace and everyone looks, non-European and non-African and non-Asian, there is an assumption now that seems to be made. Every single person there, we need to check and make sure that every single person here is not from, Mexico, Central or South America. Mm-hmm. And that is in tension with the statutory basis that says, look, just because you look like a person from a particular country or a particular national or ethnic, origin, that's not enough to detain you. That's what the law says. But that doesn't seem to be honored at this point. And the attitude, where does this attitude that it's okay to dress in black, that it's okay not to identify yourself, that it's okay to throw everyone, in a factory up against the wall come from? Well, it comes from the top. It comes from what is said, the rhetoric that comes out of the White House. And it comes from the statements by the Attorney General of the United States, by the head of the Department of Homeland Security. Just as an example about what I consider a call to lawlessness, to lack of respect for the rule of law, to lack of respect for the people in this country, you and me, Bobbin, and everyone else in this country. Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, has told corporate America they do not need to follow a law with respect to TikTok, purchase of the TikTok app, passed by Congress last year, challenged. I mean, the law said, TikTok has to be sold by its Chinese owners or it's going to be shut down. And you can't buy the app. You can't sell the app. Well, that was followed. It was challenged. And the U.S. Supreme Court, if I'm recalling correctly, unanimously, 9-0, upheld that congressional statute. TikTok was taken off of the app stores. This administration comes in, and the Attorney General says to those people who are interested in purchasing the TikTok app, selling the TikTok app, you don't have to follow that law that was passed by Congress and upheld by the Supreme Court. We get to decide, we, the administration, the president gets to decide what national security requires with respect to purchase and sale of the TikTok app. Now, that to me is a call to lawlessness. How on earth does the Attorney General of the United States, a lawyer, get to offer advice that it's okay to ignore the law? Now, if I'm an ICE agent out in the field and I hear the person who is ultimately going to be responsible for defending or not defending my actions as an agent saying, don't have to follow the law, It seems to me that I'm being told that the general constraints about how we should conduct ourselves as law enforcement officers, well, the guy keeps telling us, the president, these are all murderers and rapists. They're all the worst, people, and we've got to get them all out of this country. That I am going to feel less inclined to respect those people and to respect the legal, moral, ethical norms that have up to now constrained the way in which I'm going to act toward those people.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that you brought up. One, you talked about the idea of the border. And I think from a civil rights perspective, we sort of understand this 100-mile rule. Like if you're within 100 miles of a border, basically that's considered the zone in which border enforcement can technically happen, or shades of it. I can't remember the exact doctrine, but I just know the 100-mile rule, which puts most major cities in the United States in that area on the western coast and the east coast. Uh, and so there is this level of, I think you explained really well, a different type of oversight, regulations, guidelines that ICE has that's distinguishable from, and mandates that's distinguishable from other law enforcement actors. The other thing you talked about was this idea of reasonable suspicion, which, I think you talked about like the tension that exists. Like, how does one create reasonable suspicion? And the way it is, it's the color of your skin, the way you look, the dress, the language that you speak, that is what is basically being used to determine reasonable suspicion, which is, race, ethnicity, national origin, or physical, biological sort of manifestations of what they think those are. And so that is problematic because, yeah, I was reading or listening this morning on NPR, and they were talking about the ICE enforcement in LA that's been going on, and it's been predominantly in Black and Brown communities. Um, which is to, again, illustrate sort of or highlight where the focus of ICE is, what they're looking at, and who they're pulling over or, detaining or arresting, in the communities, or where they're, what communities they're looking at most closely. The chilling thing now that we see, like there's videos of ICE agents, plainclothes, just jumping out of cars, cornering people. It was like a gardener, ice cream salesman, like, just not, these aren't criminals or people that have committed crimes. They may be here without status, but they haven't they haven't really committed any additional crimes. They're just trying to arrest and detain as many people as they can to, juke up the numbers. But as someone that is always like looked to history and, a historian, not by profession, but a historian just by practice, you have studied, what happened in the lead up to Nazi Germany and in Nazi Germany. You've, understood what's happened in other oppressive regimes. I mean, I'm spoon feeding this to you or teeing this up, but like the parallels that you see with a police force of this nature that's secretive, that's operating with minimal oversight, that has directions or impressions from the people giving these mandates of lawlessness, and they can kind of do whatever they want, and now a budget bill that's going to give them the funding and the resources to be bigger than most military forces in the world. I mean, I guess I teed it up. What are the parallels that we're seeing? Like what path are we headed on, or the dangers that you see with all of this?
Well, I think that we are headed, Bobbin, on a very dangerous path. It has been said by many people, philosophers, civil rights leaders, for a very, very long time. None of us are safe unless all of us are safe. There is no sense of, justice for anyone unless there is justice for everyone. And it comes up in treatment of prisoners. One of the employees of the OJRC who spent time in prison and is now doing the wonderful legal work that he had done while on the inside, on the outside as a paid tax-paying employee, going to be writing an article, points out that whether we're talking about prisoners or immigrants or any other disfavored group of society, if any one person, any one group is in a situation in which we as a country allow their rights to be taken away, none of us are safe from having our rights taken away. And interestingly, in June, a very good friend of mine who now is a U.S. citizen was born in what was then Czechoslovakia and grew up in the communist country that Czechoslovakia was until the wall came down. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and the whole Soviet empire collapsed. In talking with him about it, I mean, he's just shaking his head and saying, "That's what I grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in a country where none of us were safe, where everyone around you could be an informer, where everyone around you could be, a member of the Czech secret police in plain clothes, and at any moment could seize you, could act against you, could go into your home, and you didn't have recourse to the U.S. Constitution, due process, the Fourth Amendment, right against search and seizure. You don't have it. Didn't have it. And in talking with him about his personal experience of this, how that chilled the entire society, how it made people afraid, made people less willing to speak out, and that's the danger that we're now facing. The settlements that Trump is extracting, from law firms, from universities, from CBS. CBS wants the owner of it wants to sell CBS. They need a license, a permit from the federal government to do it. They're not going to get that license if they continue to speak out against Trump, because he acts in this retributive way. And they just entered a settlement to pay him $16 million. Yeah, all right. They're not going to miss that. And to change the content on the air. And, to see, in all of the, dictatorships around the world, how the government takes over and controls the media is another aspect of this chilling of our general social intercourse, and that's happening here. There's defunding NPR. You listen to NPR this morning, and they don't want NPR. It's too liberal. Well, liberal. They're giving us information. There's no such thing as fake news. Something is either true, it's real, or it's fake. It ain't fake news. It's an oxymoron, and it just burns me that phrase is something that is common in our discourse now. So I think, Bobbin, what you said about the path we're on and the historical precedents, we really need to be conscious of that as a society. We need to look around at what happens when the executive assumes more power, when law enforcement doesn't have to identify itself, when they jump out of cars wearing black uniforms. How in hell do you know whether this is a law enforcement officer or it's one of the horrible bad people that the government keeps telling you is around and trying to harm you? Mm-hmm. You don't know. The guy is the hooded guy in black, the bad guy, the robber, the horrible rapist who came here from Mexico, or is he the meth freak white guy who grew up and got burned out on meth, or is it your local ICE agent? You don't know, and when you don't know, there is a tendency at times to react violently, and then you're chilled because you don't know you're not going to act,
Yeah.
and you're not going to talk, and you're not going to complain. If by complaining and speaking out against the administration causes the head of the administration to sue you and then extort a settlement from you, 50% tariffs now on Brazil. This is just another piece of the same thing. Why? Because Trump says former President Bolsonaro is being the victim of a witch hunt because the Brazilians have indicted him and are prosecuting him through their legal system for doing things that Trump says, oh, he shouldn't be prosecuted for that. They did that to me 10 times worse.
Yeah.
Same thing. It's all of a piece.
Yeah, I mean, going back to this like secret police and who's reporting, who's not reporting, who you can trust, not trust. I mean, this is from our own organizational standpoint, like we're starting to do know your rights trainings. And if people are interested in know your rights trainings for ICE, dealing with ICE, reach out to us. But one of the comments that I made at a recent know your rights training, trying to reinforce that these law enforcement adjacent actors like hospitals, schools, social service centers, support areas, have to be mindful of the fact that they don't get co-opted or become complicit in the enforcement of law enforcement. And this is, I think, the scary thing that happens is when you don't know what your rights are, when you don't know who the police or, the law enforcement actors are, and they're creating this fear and this anxiety, people may end up reporting on people inadvertently. And I think right now is a very important moment to ensure that we create these firewalls to ensure that, at least at a minimum, that these law enforcement actors, their powers aren't being expanded inadvertently by us, that we're participating in their ability to be able to effectuate the things that they're trying to effectuate. It doesn't mean to obstruct. It just means don't be complicit in their actions, at least at this moment. And that's sort of where we're starting from. But I think that becomes the scarier part. Like you go see a doctor, you go see to your school, and all of a sudden they're reporting on you. They're making these allegations or reports. I think this person is a foreign criminal and he needs to be picked up, or she needs to be picked up. And then all of a sudden you have ICE agents there. And I think that's the thing, which is really scary. I mean, fortunately in Oregon, there's laws. We call them sanctuary laws, but basically it limits the information sharing between state actors and federal government as relates to immigration. So we have some insulation here, but I think in other states where that insulation doesn't exist, you can begin to see how quickly this creep can happen. And all of a sudden, you have people like your neighbors calling on people, and reporting on people. So I think to the point that you're making, or have made, like, I mean, we can very quickly get to that place in our society where we're reporting on each other or afraid of each other just because of someone's skin color or the way they look or the language they speak.
Absolutely. And the next step from that is your use of the word obstruction. No, we're not going to obstruct, but we don't want to be complicit. Obstruction versus avoiding complicity is in the eye of the beholder.
Mm-hmm.
And the current beholder, the federal government, the federal law enforcement authorities, view of what is on the obstruction side of the line as opposed to the I'm just not being complicit side of the line is very different than it was a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that in the treatment of the U.S. Congressman, the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, places like that where local officials, the judge in Wisconsin, local officials are saying, we have a right to see whether or not your facility, your ICE detention facility, complies with the laws of our state, our city, that you have to comply with. If you want to have a building, you got to do this and that. If you want to have our people in your building, you have to comply with certain laws. We have a right to inspect that. And they get prosecuted for trying to carry out their responsibilities. They are not thinking that they're being obstructionist. And the other thing that I've seen is a number of people being charged with the federal crime of assault of ICE officials.
Hmm.
And what is an assault on an ICE official is in the eye of the ICE official. If you touch my shoulder in an effort to get my attention so you can talk to me, we are now potentially subject to prosecution, as opposed to what would happen in other circumstances. Hey, wait a minute, let me finish this conversation and I'll then, be with you. So you
Yeah.
get chilled, you don't act, you try to avoid obstructing as a matter of a criminal obstruction, but someone else thinks, no, what you're doing is obstructing my
Yeah.
work.
And thanks for that clarification, because I want to be sure as we're delivering information that we're not encouraging people to break the law affirmatively, but to your point, not being complicit, or not, it's not even been implicit the moment that you're not actually effectuating the mandate of what it is the federal government is asking for, the Trump administration is asking for. That in itself has been defined as obstruction, even though people have the right not to do that, they're not obligated to. And so I think it is sort of, in this instance, the definitions um, are being perverted and used in ways to, whether you call it political assassination, silencing, chilling. I mean, it's all these different things that are happening.
Yeah, yeah, and in the CLE that we're putting on next week, we OJRC with the immigration uh, innovation law lab people, that it the second half of that is how to represent people safely.
Yeah.
And the very fact that we have to put on a CLE, one of whose components is you have to be very careful that what you're doing in representing people who are facing removal from the country, that you don't get yourself in trouble. That in and of itself is a great example of how the environment has changed and how our actions as lawyers, as directors of a public interest organization, have changed already. We need to be conscious of that as we think about what is happening in the country.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your thoughts, and, just sharing some of your impressions about, what's going on with federal law enforcement, the distinctions, and just helping breaking it down. I think it's really useful for people to hear, the differences, the trajectory, some of the laws and the mandates that kind of govern what's happening, or what's, how it's being reinterpreted. Yeah, every week I see these videos online of these ICE enforcement actions happening in these very horrific and disturbing ways. And I think it's pretty obvious to anyone paying attention that this is not really about ICE enforcement. It's much more about just sending a signal, and this sort of pageantry of, you never know where we are, you never know when we're going to jump out, and you never know when you're going to be deported or removed or extradited or kidnapped and sent to the concentration camp in Florida or some other country. I mean, this is where we're at, is this fear and anxiety that's being created in these communities now, and that in large part is the point, right? They want to create this fear, and the randomness of it, exacerbates that, and I think makes it emphatic that we're out to get you. You never know. So, but
Sure.
we'll push back, and like you said, we're hosting a CLE next week, a legal training for attorneys on how to be able to advocate for clients who have been arrested and detained, using habeas as the vehicle. We have Know Your Rights trainings that we're doing for businesses, healthcare facilities, institutions, wherever. So anyone's interested, we can come in and go over how and explain what is going on, give an overview of the state sanctuary law, and inform people of what rights they have and how to be able to protect the people that they work with and the communities that they're in. So hopefully we'll continue to keep putting these resources out, and as a community we can push back and ensure this thing, we can at least stop it from growing and metastasizing into something more insidious. But thanks for your time, Steve. We'll be back in the next couple of weeks with another episode with Steve. Topic to be determined, but there's always something. Have a good one.